Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped into the briefing room at Naval Base Coronado, her boots clicking against the polished floor. The room buzzed with nervous energy as dozens of officers filled the chairs, their dress uniforms crisp and medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. At the front of the room, Admiral Robert Harrison commanded attention with his imposing presence, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of 30 years of distinguished service. Sarah had earned her place in this room through sheer determination and exceptional performance. At 28, she was one of the youngest officers to ever receive an invitation to present operational strategy to such high-ranking officials. Her hands held a thick folder containing months of research, intelligence analysis, and tactical recommendations that could potentially save countless lives in future operations. The meeting had been called to address a critical issue plaguing special operations teams. Recent missions in hostile territories had resulted in higher than acceptable casualty rates, and conventional approaches were proving inadequate against increasingly sophisticated enemy tactics. Sarah had identified patterns in the failures and developed an innovative strategy that combined psychological warfare with unconventional deployment methods. As officers settled into their seats, Sarah noticed familiar faces among the crowd. There was Commander Mitchell, who had mentored her during her early years. Captain Rodriguez, known for his tactical brilliance, sat near the front, and scattered throughout the room were several Navy SEALs, their quiet confidence unmistakable even in formal settings. Admiral Harrison called the meeting to order, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. He outlined the challenges they faced and the need for fresh perspectives. When he announced that Lieutenant Chen would be presenting a new operational framework, Sarah stood and made her way to the front of the room. She began her presentation with confidence, explaining how traditional infiltration methods had become predictable to enemy forces. Her voice was steady as she detailed the intelligence patterns she had discovered, showing how enemy forces had adapted their countermeasures specifically to defeat standard SEAL team approaches. The room listened intently as Sarah explained her alternative strategy. Instead of relying solely on stealth and overwhelming force, her plan incorporated elements of deception and misdirection. She proposed using smaller, more agile teams that could adapt quickly to changing situations. Her research had identified specific psychological triggers that could be exploited to create confusion among enemy ranks. As she spoke, Sarah noticed some officers nodding in agreement, while others seemed skeptical. The SEALs in the room listened with particular attention, their experienced eyes evaluating every detail of her proposal. She had spent countless hours studying their previous missions, interviewing team members, and analyzing both successes and failures. Admiral Harrison interrupted her mid-sentence, his expression shifting from professional interest to visible irritation. The room fell silent as he stood up, towering over the podium with an intimidating presence. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. He questioned Sarah's qualifications to propose changes to proven military tactics. His words grew sharper as he pointed out that she had never seen combat, never led men into hostile territory, and never faced the split-second decisions that determined life and death in the field. The Admiral's criticism became increasingly personal and dismissive. He suggested that academic theories had no place in real-world operations and that inexperienced officers should focus on supporting roles rather than attempting to redesign strategies that had been refined through decades of actual combat experience. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks as the Admiral's words echoed through the silent room. Other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking down at their papers to avoid making eye contact. The weight of professional humiliation pressed down on her shoulders as the Admiral continued his public dismantling of her credibility. He gestured dismissively at her research materials, calling them textbook fantasies that failed to account for the brutal realities of warfare. His tone suggested that her presence in the room was itself questionable. that someone of her limited experience had no business addressing seasoned combat veterans. The Admiral concluded his harsh assessment by suggesting that Sarah should observe quietly and learn from her superiors, rather than attempting to lecture men who had earned their expertise through blood and sacrifice. His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone in the room to contradict his assessment. Sarah stood frozen at the front of the room, her carefully prepared presentation scattered on the table before her. The faces staring back at her showed a mixture of sympathy, embarrassment, and professional discomfort. She had never felt so small, so insignificant in her entire military career. The silence stretched endlessly as Sarah gathered her materials with trembling hands. Her dreams of contributing meaningfully to special operations strategy seemed to crumble under the weight of the Admiral's dismissal. She wondered if her career would ever recover from such a public humiliation in front of so many influential officers. As she prepared to leave the podium in defeat, Sarah caught sight of the SEALs in the room. Their expressions were unreadable, their posture unchanged. She had no way of knowing that her words had resonated with men who had lived through the exact failures she had identified, men who had lost teammates to the predictable tactics she sought to replace. The Admiral returned to his seat, apparently satisfied that he had put an inexperienced officer in her proper place. The room remained tense and uncomfortable, waiting to see what would happen next. Sarah's humiliation seemed complete, her professional reputation potentially destroyed in a matter of minutes. But something was about to change in that room, something that would shift the entire dynamic and reveal truths that Admiral Harrison had never considered. The SEALs had been listening more carefully than anyone realized, and they had recognized something in Sarah's presentation that the Admiral had completely missed. What happened next would become legendary within the special operations community, a story that would be told and retold for years to come. The young lieutenant who had been so thoroughly dismissed was about to discover that respect in the military is earned through wisdom and courage, not just through rank and years of service. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson had been sitting in the back row, his weathered hands clasped tightly together as he listened to Lieutenant Chen's presentation. At 35, Marcus had completed 7 combat deployments and led countless high-risk missions. He had seen good men die because of tactical limitations that everyone seemed to accept as unchangeable facts of warfare. When Admiral Harrison began his brutal dismissal of Sarah's ideas, Marcus felt his jaw clench involuntarily. The Admiral spoke of combat experience as if it were the only qualification that mattered, but Marcus knew that fresh perspectives often came from those who hadn't been conditioned to accept deadly compromises as normal. Sitting 2 rows ahead, Petty Officer First Class David Ramirez shifted in his seat. He had lost his best friend during a mission 6 months earlier, a mission that had failed for exactly the reasons Lieutenant Chen had identified. The enemy had anticipated their approach, countered their tactics, and turned what should have been a surgical strike into a bloody ambush. Master Chief James Parker, the most senior enlisted SEAL in the room, had been taking careful notes throughout Sarah's presentation. At 42, he had served with distinction for over 2 decades and had developed an eye for tactical innovation. He recognized immediately that the lieutenant had done something remarkable. She had identified patterns that combat-experienced operators had been too close to see clearly. As the Admiral continued his harsh critique, Parker exchanged glances with several other SEALs in the room. They had all lived through the consequences of tactical predictability. They had all seen missions fail because enemy forces had learned to anticipate and counter their standard operating procedures. Sergeant First Class Tony Morrison, a former Army Ranger who had cross-trained with SEAL teams, remembered a mission in Afghanistan where his unit had walked directly into a trap. The enemy had studied American tactics so thoroughly that they had prepared specific countermeasures for every standard approach. Morrison had watched good soldiers die because their training had made them predictable. The room remained silent as Sarah gathered her papers, her face flushed with embarrassment and professional devastation. Admiral Harrison seemed satisfied with his demonstration of authority, apparently believing he had educated a naive young officer about the realities of military hierarchy. But Master Chief Parker had heard enough. He stood slowly, his movement causing heads to turn throughout the room. When a Master Chief with his reputation and experience stood during a briefing, everyone paid attention. His voice cut through the uncomfortable silence with quiet authority. Parker addressed the room, not the Admiral specifically, but his words carried clear intent. He spoke about the mission failures they had all witnessed, the patterns of enemy adaptation that had cost American lives. He acknowledged that Lieutenant Chen had never seen combat, but he pointed out that sometimes it took an outside perspective to identify problems that those inside the situation couldn't see. The Master Chief detailed specific instances where conventional tactics had failed, where enemy forces had successfully predicted and countered American approaches. He spoke with the authority of someone who had buried teammates, who had written letters to widows, who had lived with the consequences of tactical limitations. As Parker spoke, other SEALs began to nod in agreement. Chief Thompson stood next, adding his voice to support the Master Chief's assessment. He described how enemy forces in his area of operations had developed increasingly sophisticated countermeasures against standard infiltration techniques. Admiral Harrison's expression shifted from satisfaction to surprise as more SEALs rose to their feet. These were men whose opinions carried enormous weight within the special operations community. Their combat records were beyond question, their tactical expertise proven through years of successful missions under the most dangerous conditions. Petty Officer Ramirez stood and spoke about his friend who had died during the failed mission. His voice was steady but emotional as he described how the enemy had been waiting for them, how their approach had been anticipated and countered. He looked directly at Sarah as he spoke, acknowledging that her analysis had identified exactly the problems that had led to his friend's death. One by one, more SEALs rose to their feet. Each man who stood represented years of combat experience, numerous successful missions, and the respect of their peers. They weren't defying Admiral Harrison directly, but they were making their position unmistakably clear. Sergeant Morrison stood and described how enemy tactics had evolved to specifically counter American training. He explained that while experience was valuable, it could also create blind spots that prevented adaptation to changing conditions. He praised Sarah's research methodology and her willingness to challenge accepted practices. The Admiral found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't dismiss the opinions of these elite operators without undermining his own credibility. These men had earned their right to speak through blood and sacrifice, the very qualifications he had insisted were necessary for tactical input. Chief Thompson addressed Sarah directly, asking her to continue her presentation. He wanted to hear her complete analysis, her specific recommendations, and her methodology for implementing change. The other SEALs voiced their agreement, creating a chorus of support that filled the room. Sarah looked around the room in amazement. The same men whom the Admiral had suggested she should learn from were now asking to learn from her. The validation meant more than any promotion or commendation ever could. These warriors, who had proven themselves in the most dangerous situations imaginable, were standing for her ideas. Master Chief Parker made the situation even clearer. He requested that Lieutenant Chen be given the opportunity to complete her presentation without interruption. He suggested that her research deserved serious consideration and formal evaluation by the Special Operations Planning Committee. The Admiral found himself isolated in his opposition. The very men he had cited as examples of superior experience were contradicting his assessment. He couldn't retreat from his position without losing face, but he couldn't maintain it without opposing the collective judgment of the room's most experienced operators. Commander Mitchell, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. He noted that the purpose of the meeting was to address tactical failures and improve mission success rates. He suggested that all ideas deserved consideration, especially those that addressed documented problems. Captain Rodriguez added his voice to the growing consensus. He pointed out that military innovation had always required challenging established practices, and that Lieutenant Chen's analytical approach represented exactly the kind of fresh thinking they needed. The room's dynamic had completely reversed. What had begun as Sarah's humiliation had transformed into a powerful demonstration of respect and recognition from the people whose opinions mattered most. The SEALs had recognized something in her work that the Admiral had missed entirely. Admiral Harrison realized that his harsh dismissal of Sarah's ideas had backfired spectacularly. Instead of demonstrating strong leadership, he had revealed his own rigid thinking and failure to recognize valuable insights. The men whose respect he needed to maintain his authority were openly supporting the young officer he had tried to humiliate. Sarah felt a surge of confidence returning as she looked at the faces supporting her. These weren't politicians or administrators offering empty encouragement. These were warriors who had seen her ideas and recognized their value. Their support meant that her research might actually save lives in future operations. The Master Chief made one final statement that would echo through the special operations community for years to come. He said that respect in their profession wasn't automatically granted based on rank or years of service. It was earned through wisdom, courage, and the willingness to put mission success above personal ego. As the room fell silent again, everyone understood that something significant had just occurred. A young officer's tactical innovations had been validated by the most experienced operators in the military, while a senior admiral had revealed his own limitations. The balance of authority in the room had shifted permanently, and Sarah Chen had emerged as an unlikely but undeniable voice of innovation in special operations planning. The tension in the briefing room reached its peak as Master Chief Parker's words hung in the air. Admiral Harrison's face had grown rigid with controlled anger and wounded pride. He was a man accustomed to absolute authority, and the open support for Lieutenant Chen's ideas represented a challenge to his judgment that he couldn't ignore. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her hands no longer trembling as she felt the solid wall of support from the SEALs behind her. The weight of their experience and their willingness to stand up for her ideas gave her a courage she had never known she possessed. She looked directly at Admiral Harrison, waiting to see how he would respond to the unprecedented situation. The Admiral's voice was cold when he finally spoke. He reminded everyone present about the importance of military hierarchy and proper chain of command. He suggested that emotional responses to combat losses might be clouding professional judgment, and that tactical decisions should be made by officers with appropriate rank and responsibility. His words were carefully chosen to reassert his authority without directly criticizing the SEALs who had spoken up. But everyone in the room understood the subtext. He was dismissing their combat experience as emotionally compromised and their tactical judgment as subordinate to his administrative authority. Master Chief Parker exchanged glances with the other senior enlisted men in the room. They had served long enough to recognize when political maneuvering was taking precedence over mission effectiveness. The Admiral was more concerned with maintaining his position than with evaluating ideas that might save American lives. What happened next would become one of the most talked-about moments in naval special warfare history. Master Chief Parker came to attention, his posture snapping into perfect military bearing. His hand rose in a crisp salute directed not at Admiral Harrison, but at Lieutenant Sarah Chen. The gesture sent shockwaves through the room. A Master Chief saluting a lieutenant violated every convention of military hierarchy, but Parker's action carried a message that transcended normal protocol. He was acknowledging tactical excellence and moral courage over simple rank structure. Chief Thompson immediately followed Parker's lead, rising to attention and delivering his own sharp salute to Sarah. His action was a clear statement that he valued her analytical abilities and innovative thinking above traditional deference to authority. One by one, every SEAL in the room stood and saluted the young lieutenant who had dared to challenge conventional thinking. Petty Officer Ramirez saluted with tears in his eyes, thinking of his fallen friend and the possibility that Sarah's ideas might prevent future tragedies. Sergeant Morrison saluted while remembering the soldiers he had lost to predictable tactics. The visual was stunning and unprecedented. The most elite warriors in the American military were rendering honors to a young officer who had never seen combat, but whose intellectual courage and tactical innovation had earned their deepest respect. Their salutes were a powerful rebuke to the Admiral's dismissive attitude and a validation of merit over politics. Admiral Harrison watched in apparent disbelief as his own authority was systematically challenged by the very men he had expected to support him. The salutes weren't technically insubordination, they were simply showing respect to a fellow officer. But the message was unmistakably clear. Commander Mitchell and Captain Rodriguez found themselves faced with a choice. They could support the Admiral's position and maintain traditional hierarchy, or they could acknowledge what the SEALs had recognized in Sarah's work. After a moment's hesitation, both officers stood and saluted as well, adding their voices to the growing consensus. Other officers throughout the room began to follow suit. What had started as support from the SEALs was spreading throughout the entire briefing room. Men and women who had initially been intimidated by the Admiral's harsh criticism were now finding the courage to express their own professional opinions. The collective salute lasted for what seemed like an eternity. Sarah stood at attention, accepting the unprecedented honor while fighting back tears of gratitude and vindication. She had never imagined that her research would receive such powerful validation from the people she most respected. When the salutes finally ended, Master Chief Parker spoke again. He formally requested that Lieutenant Chen be given the opportunity to complete her presentation and that her recommendations be given serious consideration by the appropriate tactical planning committees. His words carried the weight of every SEAL who had stood with him. Admiral Harrison found himself completely isolated. He could order the SEALs to disregard Sarah's ideas, but doing so would create an open confrontation with the special operations community that he couldn't win. These men had influence that extended far beyond his immediate command, and their opinions would be heard regardless of his preferences. The Admiral's response revealed his character in the clearest possible terms. Rather than acknowledging the validity of the SEAL's assessment or showing any interest in ideas that might improve mission outcomes, he doubled down on his opposition. He announced that the meeting was concluded and that all tactical recommendations would continue to follow established protocols. But his words carried no weight anymore. The real authority in the room had shifted to the operators who would actually implement any new tactics. Master Chief Parker quietly informed Sarah that the Special Operations Planning Committee would be very interested in her complete analysis and recommendations. As the meeting dissolved, the SEALs approached Sarah individually to discuss specific aspects of her research. They shared details about mission failures that supported her theories and offered insights that could help refine her tactical recommendations. What had started as a formal briefing had become an impromptu strategy session between the Navy's brightest tactical minds. Within hours, word of the incident had spread throughout the Naval Special Operations community. The story of the young lieutenant who had earned salutes from Master Chiefs became legendary, representing the triumph of innovative thinking over rigid bureaucracy. Admiral Harrison's career trajectory changed dramatically after that day. His inability to recognize valuable tactical innovations and his treatment of a promising young officer became marks against his leadership record. He found himself increasingly isolated from the operational community he was supposed to lead. Sarah's career, on the other hand, took off like a rocket. Her tactical innovations were implemented and tested, proving remarkably effective in reducing casualty rates and improving mission success. She became the youngest officer ever selected for the Naval War College's Advanced Tactical Studies program. More importantly, the incident sparked broader changes in how the military evaluated and implemented new ideas. The Pentagon established formal channels for junior officers to present tactical innovations directly to operational planners, bypassing the bureaucratic filters that had nearly suppressed Sarah's breakthrough thinking. Master Chief Parker retired 2 years later, but not before seeing Sarah's tactics save American lives in operations around the world. At his retirement ceremony, he spoke about the importance of recognizing good ideas, regardless of their source, and the responsibility of experienced warriors to mentor and support innovative thinkers. The briefing room where it all happened was later renamed the Chen Innovation Center, acknowledging the young lieutenant whose courage to challenge conventional thinking had changed special operations forever. Her story became required reading at military academies, teaching future officers that true leadership sometimes means standing up to authority in defense of better ideas. Years later, when Sarah had achieved the rank of Admiral herself, she would tell young officers that the most important salute she ever received wasn't the one rendered to her by subordinates, but the one she earned from Master Chiefs, who valued tactical excellence over political correctness. The incident became a defining moment not just for Sarah Chen, but for the entire culture of military innovation. It proved that in the profession of arms, respect must be earned through competence and courage, not simply granted through rank and tradition. The SEALs who stood and saluted that day had recognized something that Admiral Harrison had missed, that the best ideas can come from anyone, anywhere, and that true leaders create environments where innovation can flourish regardless of hierarchy. The legacy of that moment continued to influence military culture for decades, reminding leaders at every level that their primary responsibility is mission success, not personal authority. And somewhere in the special operations community, Master Chiefs still tell the story of the day they saluted a lieutenant and changed the future of American warfare.